Recording session.
Sure.
All right, good morning, everybody. This is Nawaf al your favorite English teacher. I have with me an amazing YouTuber who just finished her PhD in teacher education and has been a CELTA trainer and tutor for more than 20 plus years. I would love to introduce to you guys Jo Gakonga. Jo, good morning. Good.
Good morning. Well, it's actually good afternoon where I am, but thank you very much for that nice introduction.
You're welcome. Well, currently it's morning in Kuwait. What time is it at your place?
10 past 4 in the afternoon.
Right. It's Sydney, Australia, right?
That's right. Yes, yes. I'm based in beautiful Sydney. It's very nice, very close to the beach and warm. So it's nicer than the UK at this time of year.
Yeah, of course, of course. I've always wanted to visit Sydney, but work always comes first.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So before we start the interview, could you tell us a little bit more about your professional self?
Sure, sure. So I started English teaching a very long time ago, 1989, where I'm sure you weren't even born then. And it always makes me feel very old when I admit that. And I started off in private language schools. I worked in Taiwan and in various other places, and then kind of fell into CELTA training, I suppose, a bit later on when I went back to the UK, and then later on got a job at Warwick University teaching on the MA TESOL. And that actually, previous to that, I'd done an MA there, and I'd done the same MA that I taught on actually. And that got me into sort of the online world and ELT training and making online courses and what have you. So that's where that came in. And then about 2 years ago, I took voluntary severance from Warwick and came here to Sydney. And I work just freelance now on my website. And I'm very happy with the freedom that it allows me. So that's great.
That sounds very, very lovely. So I have a question. What really got you into the ELT field? It is quite challenging, but also interesting. Tell us your side.
Yeah, so I was 25 and had a degree in agriculture, not what you might think of the obvious route into ELT. And I was traveling actually here in Australia, and then I went into Southeast Asia, and I completely fell in love with everything actually. And I didn't want to leave. I wanted to travel more, but I was running out of money. And somebody said to me, and this is, perhaps I'm a little ashamed to admit it, I was completely unqualified. Somebody said, "Oh, you can go to Taiwan or Japan and teach English." And I said, "Well, what do I know about English teaching?" They said, "Oh, it'll be fine." And so I went, and I was very lucky. I was really lucky. I got a job in a school which was very supportive. And I know from later experience, there are lots of schools that aren't so supportive. But the one that I had a job in was very supportive. And they employed somebody to basically to help you to prepare your lessons before, like in the staff room, which was super helpful. And I stayed there for a little while, and then I went back to the UK and did a cert course, and then carried on teaching from there, and ended up later on doing a Delta, and as I say, doing an MA, and now just finished my PhD. So I have done some qualifications since, but I very much fell into it just because I didn't want to stop traveling.
That is a very amazing thing. I also enjoy traveling very much as a teacher, and I always believe that every ELT professional should at least travel minimum 4 to 5 countries, if not for teaching, at least to immerse themselves into other cultures. That way, their intercultural competence can rise with every level of teaching. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. I mean, look, I think everybody should travel anyway, actually, not just ELT teachers. I think everybody should. I would agree with you, but take it further. Um, I think it just is a great way to, as you say, I mean, intercultural competence is exactly right. But I think really what it's about is just learning to be more tolerant and more open to different situations, which is exactly what that means, of course. Um, but it makes it sound very, very formal, I think, in that way. And really, it's just about learning to accept different kinds of people and see different kinds of situations and see that your normality isn't
Yeah.
everybody's normality. I think that's true, definitely. And
Uh,
learning another language, of course, if you're teaching one, is very helpful. It helps you to be a lot more. I mean, I'm in the very lucky position that English is my first language. Maybe it's lucky, maybe it's not, but it's certainly the case. Um, I always have, so I think that if you're in a position of having learnt English yourself, you're obviously much more aware of as a second language, you're much more aware of the difficulties that exist. And that makes you in lots of ways a much more empathetic teacher and knowledgeable teacher.
of course, of course.
And so I think that, learning another language helps you to be more empathetic and tolerant of people's difficulties, because it's hard to learn another language.
I definitely agree with this because I've been teaching secondary stage English for 2 years, but I did teach outside my field of work for like a year or two. So Kuwait as a Gulf state, they're mostly a monolingual society because they prefer to speak Arabic more than English. But yeah, I mean that doesn't mean that we have very excellent English speakers in Kuwait. But if you compare it to other Gulf states, if you have visited any, other Gulf states such as Bahrain and the UAE, they're more immersed into the English language because of the much bigger number of expats coming into the country. But if you do come teach in the Gulf, you will see that teaching in the Gulf has a very interesting experience in it because you're going to be looking that a lot of students will be shocked that we haven't been taught this in school. This is the first time we see it. And I've seen this after completing my CELTA and July in June to 20 in June 2022. But yeah, but let's move to another question. So, have you managed any ELT institutes in the past?
No, actually, I've very deliberately avoided management, I think, although, I've certainly been in charge of CELTA courses in various institutions, but no, I think when I started I started teaching, obviously, and did work in a few different institutions, and also worked in primary schools and international schools and things. And I think that as you go further down the ELT road, you kind of are faced with two options. I mean, you could definitely do both of them. One's sort of management and one's teacher education.
Mm.
And I decided very early on that management wasn't really my field and that I'd much prefer to be in teacher education. So that's where I've really focused my efforts.
That is amazing. So, speaking of institutes, I would love to hear your views about certain institutes or universities and schools that had some issues with ELT professionals. So, I've been reading articles and watching videos of ELT teachers who were able to escape these institutes by either running away or by doing the quiet quitting method. Have you heard of quiet quitting?
Not doing your job and eventually being fired. Is that what you mean, or?
No, no, no. I mean, quiet quitting is as a definition in the business world or in any field, is that you're doing your bare minimum while finding another job, and at that same time you're putting your 2 week notice before leaving the job. Have you heard of it?
No, no.
Yeah. So have you?
I,
Yeah. Have
I,
you? Sorry. Please continue. I'm very sorry.
no. Sorry. Continue with your question.
So with the question being is, have you ever met teachers who've told you like horror stories or horror work stories of working in a toxic ELT institute before?
You certainly hear some stories. Of course, there are some just as any industry, I guess, there are some institutes which are more reputable than others, and some which will support their teachers more than others. And I always say to people who I train on CELTA, who gets to the end of CELTA and people want information and advice, obviously, about finding work. And I always say to people that you should be trying to interview the school as much as they're interviewing you. And you should be asking questions like, what kind of support can I expect as a newly qualified teacher? Because it's not abnormal to expect or unreasonable to expect support? What kind of resources do you have available? You know, how these sort of questions. And I think that my feeling is that these kind of questions don't single you out as needy or unprofessional, but in fact the opposite, that they single you out as somebody who is serious about the job and wanting to do a good job and serious about their own professional development. And so that's what I would say to anybody who asked me. I think that there's, you know, as I say, there are some really excellent, reputable organisations out there, but also exploitative ones. I mean, that's, I think, the same in any industry.
I definitely agree with this. And let's move to another topic, which is the time differences between teaching. So when you finished your CELTA degree and the Delta, you finished your CELTA in the 90s or the 80s, right?
Yeah, well, actually, in honesty, it wasn't CELTA, it was the University of Aston's version of their CERT TESOL, which was a similar sort of thing. So that was in 1990, yes, and I did my Delta in 1997, and then the MA in 2010, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the reason I want to ask, I've always asked my senior teachers at work, and they told me that, okay, so technology did not exist back then, like as advanced technology, but they did have like devices such as the basic projectors and other related to tech. So how was teaching English back then? How was it focused on and comparing to today, like especially in the 90s? I would love to hear your story about it.
Now you make me feel really old. How was it? How was it to teach in the old days, Joe? Um, I think that actually, I mean, the obvious difference is online teaching now. I mean, clearly that's very different.
Hmm.
And yes, when I started teaching in '89, you know, we had a whiteboard and an overhead projector if we were lucky. At the beginning, I didn't even have an overhead projector. We had course books, and that's what we worked from. And handouts. We still had photocopiers, wasn't completely in dinosaur ages. But I think that essentially pedagogy hasn't changed very much.
Hmm.
Some fashions have changed. So I look back at things that I relied on really heavily in the early days, things like Jill Hadfield's communication games, which were great books, are great books. But if you look at them now, I think that the lack of perhaps authenticity in them, the sort of more gamey stuff about them is perhaps they look a little bit dated, but the activities are actually still great. And so I think that things perhaps have moved more towards authentic communication more than they were then. Though, but in terms of pedagogy, I think still getting people to communicate together about things that they're interested in language that they want to use, actually hasn't changed at all. The big difference, I guess, in the last, what, 10 years is teaching, and particularly in the last 2-3 since the pandemic, is the prevalence of teaching online. So CELTA training was never online until the pandemic hit, and then it had to be. And actually it's been the move, I think, has been very, very successful. I don't know if you did your CELTA online or face to face.
I did it online actually,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so just to give you a background about myself, I did the CELTA first time in Abu Dhabi, the British Council of Abu Dhabi,
Mm-hmm.
and I only passed 6 teaching hours because at that time I was a fourth-year student in university, and I had no experience in teaching grammar, but I was good at teaching reading and receptive skills and like reading, speaking, and listening. But grammar was an issue. But at that time, I decided to resharpen my skills again. And when I did it again in 2022, and by God's willing, I passed the course. Thank God.
Mm-hmm. Great, great.
Yeah, and I found the online version to be much better because back then in 2019, I did ask them like, is there any option for a virtual version? And they said no, according to Cambridge laws,
No, there
like
wasn't at that point.
huh?
No, there wasn't at that point.
Yeah, and they told me like yeah, before pre-pandemic that Cambridge laws prevent this to prevent cheating and as well, forgery and fraud. Like, yeah, that does make sense. But I mean, just what if? What if something that could forces us to do that? And they said Cambridge will handle everything. Yeah, that's the thing. But
I
speaking of,
mean, I don't think it was necessarily about fraud or anything like that. I think it was just, as with many institutions, they just thought that it would be too difficult, too costly, too time consuming to put something online. And so it wasn't until it was really forced upon people that it happened. And I think that's the bottom line. It's been the same in other institutions I've worked in. They haven't wanted to go online, but as soon as they had to, then surprisingly, it happened.
yeah. So speaking of authentic communication, have you heard of something called in the ELT industry as anti-native speakerism?
I don't know about anti-native speakerism. I mean, certainly there's lots and lots of discussion about the issues with native speaker versus non-native speaker teachers. I haven't actually ever heard it expressed quite so forcefully as anti. But my feeling, I was talking to someone about this actually just this morning. I think Gabriel Artis talks about teaching as a triangle,
Mm,
so that your teaching skills are made up of your language knowledge,
mm,
and that's both your personal use of English, but also your knowledge about language. And for obviously the personal use of English usually is easier for native speakers, but the knowledge of language often isn't something you have to learn. On the other side of the triangle is pedagogical skills and knowledge of teaching. And then the third side of the triangle is your personality and how you interact with learners and your interpersonal skills.
mm.
And so all of those three things are important. And I think that for me, it's a bit of a nonsense to talk about whether a native or non-native speaker is a better teacher, because there are other things that involved apart from language proficiency, many other things. There are, of course, lots of situations in which non-native speaker teachers suffer great discrimination, unfair discrimination, and that clearly is wrong. And I think that teachers generally should be judged on those three things that I just talked about, and not on one single aspect, which is their language proficiency.
I agree
I'm not
100%.
sure about the anti, though. Maybe you can enlighten me as to the anti-native speakerism. I
Yeah,
guess that's from teachers as opposed to from learners.
yeah. So forgive me. What I meant was native speakerism, not anti. Yeah. What I
Okay.
mean by native speakerism, I'm sure you heard of it, is that there are many private schools around the world, and even
Oh
some.
yes, no, yeah. Who will only employ native speakers, or who suggest that it's. I
Yeah.
think that this, to be honest, my feeling is that this is such an ongoing issue, and in some countries it's been very well dealt with. So in the UK, for example, it's illegal and in the UK and the EU, it's illegal to discriminate against people based on their first language, whatever that is. And there's all sorts of arguments as to what native speakerism means.
Mm.
Are you if you grow up with two languages yourself, for example, are you a native speaker of English? You certainly sound like one to me, although I'm sure Arabic is what you would consider to be your first language. So, where does your proficiency, I know many people who would say that, although language X was their first language, I know many people in Kenya, for example, they would say, well, maybe Kikuyu is my first language, but actually I don't write it. I can only, I write in English, and Swahili is probably my first language. So, this kind of aspect of, well, what is your first language? What's your best language? It's sometimes hard to say.
I agree. The reason why I enjoy talking about native speakerism because I faced it before as a teacher. So
Mm.
during the pandemic, I graduated in 2020 from university. And at that time, I was applying for private schools in Kuwait, despite not being self-certified. And a lot of them just shot back an email to me like, yes, thank you for your interest, but we're just looking for either self-certified teachers or native speakers. But they did put emphasis by in bold on native speakers. And it
Mm.
did anger me a lot because there are very competent teachers, well, whether they're Arab or from any nationality, who can speak um, English way better than the administrators who work in those schools or even the heads of department. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think part of it has to do with the politics of work.
I mean, clearly, the qualification is yeah, yeah. The
Yeah,
qualification is an important one, clearly, because again, it's that knowledge of pedagogy, isn't it? But I think that, for example, if we talk about the difference between you and I, if whether you would be in terms of that side of the language thing, who would be a more effective teacher of Arab students? Of course you would be. Of course you would be, because well, for one thing, you can translate. What does this word, what's this? Oh, it's this in Arabic, and you can translate. That's hugely helpful.
yeah,
Or you know what's difficult, you know what's problematic, you know where the holes are because you've overcome them yourself. So, so much of these things are dependent on, not on one thing. It's not a simple tick box kind of, well, this person's better because, it's much more of there's a holistic range of skills, I guess, of which language proficiency is one of them, but it's certainly not the only one.
yeah. So I also want to ask you. So I have friends who are either in the ELT industry or those who are interested into getting into the ELT industry. What would you recommend them to do before pursuing the CELTA course?
Oh, well, go to my website, of course. um, what else? I suppose that generally, before CELTA, the things that CELTA centres look for when they're wanting to, when you're applying to do a CELTA, the two main things. One is your personal language proficiency, and that may or may not be whether or not you're a native speaker, because it's about your written competence as well as your spoken competence. And the other thing, of course, is your knowledge of language. So whether you know what the present perfect tense is, whether you can identify tenses and have some idea of what's difficult for learners. I think that those are the two main things. CELTA is designed, although about half of the people worldwide who take it are people who are, well, about half of people who are non-native speakers of English, and many of those would be people who are already teachers in their own right, teachers of English, teachers of something else, but very often teachers of English. And the reason that they do CELTA is because it will enable them to get a better job. Because it is well recognized, but it was originally designed as an initial teacher training qualification. I often hear it called the gold standard, but it's an initial short teacher training course. It isn't anything more than it can be in 120 hours. So I think that you have to be a bit careful about overstating what people are expected to do at the end of a CELTA course. I suppose that's the one thing. And so it's designed as an initial teacher training course. And as long as you have the personal language proficiency and the knowledge of language proficiency, those two things, then essentially that's what you should be preparing. I think it's a tough ride. There's a lot to learn in a short period of time. And so the better prepared you can be beforehand, the easier you'll find that. In my experience, the big one is making sure that you're very clear about knowledge of language. What's the present perfect? What's an abstract noun? What's the what's an article, and why are they difficult? Those things. Also, I think if you can have a head start on things like lesson planning and what a lesson plan looks like and what kind of things you need to be putting in there, that will help you, because although all that stuff is covered in CELTA for sure, it's a steep learning curve. So if you can start to get a foothold in that before you start, it'll be helpful. Things like concept check questions. If you've got an idea of what those are before you start, you'll definitely be taught those on CELTA. If you've got some idea of what they are before you start, it'll help you. So I think that those are things I would suggest to people to start thinking about before they begin. And if you're going to do an online course, then of course becoming familiar with Zoom and what the tools that it has and how to work it and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So are you affiliated with any or academic organizations? Because for example, I did my CELTA with International House London, and I've been
Mhm.
affiliated with them after the course, and they opened their own community through our website. And what about you?
Sure. Well, I work here on an ad hoc basis for International House in Sydney, doing CELTA. But mainly no, I'm just freelance, and my site isn't accredited with any other body. No.
Oh, right. So, do you have any questions for me?
Um, I don't know what if I asked if you were asked what questions you would want me to ask you, what would you say?
I'm not sure. Well, since I'm conducting the interview, maybe you would like to know something about me.
Sure. Go ahead. Tell me about your English teaching background.
Okay. I've been always interested in the English language as a child, and my cousins at the time were they were when they were in university, their initial qualification was in a Bachelor of Education in English. So one of them became an academic supervisor at the Ministry of Education in Kuwait, and her two younger brothers became heads of department. One of them teaches primary, and the other teaches at an intermediate level, which is middle school by US terms. And at that time, I was still confused what I wanted to do as both as a college major and as a career. Initially, I wanted to become a doctor, just like my mother, but I found that the teaching route is a much more noble profession because a doctor can treat only one patient, while a teacher can solve problems of an entire generation. I've learned that
Oh.
philosophy.
That's an interesting thought. On the other hand, if as a doctor you could perhaps have more, I don't know, would you have more effect on people's lives as a doctor or as a teacher? I don't know. That's an interesting one. One of the things that I always say to my trainees is that, it isn't brain surgery and
Yeah.
nobody will die. And so I think that perhaps that has always comforted me as in my professional life, that yes, you can do your very best for people. You should, I think, always do your very best for people. But ultimately, nobody will die.
Of course. The person who told me this philosophy was my father at the time, because he did teach before, but he wasn't an English teacher. When he was doing his MBA, his master's in business administration, he was teaching part-time as an adjunct professor, and he told me that despite the fact that I have an industry knowledge in business management, economics, and other business related fields, I found that teaching can inspire not just in one entire class, it could inspire more than one class into doing something that could change the world in 1 month or even within a year. That's how he told me. And it did inspire me to get into teaching. And when I heard about the CELTA qualification in 2019, I was ecstatic because I needed something to prove that I can teach. And I found it to be like a globalized as a global teaching license for the English language, something that I'm very much passionate about. But aside from ELT, I'm also interested in management, more specifically in the route of human resources in the Delta. So, should I pursue my Delta, I would love the focus to be more management based and teacher recruitment, human resources development, workforce analysis, all that jazz.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I think the Delta is a fantastic qualification. I found it to open a lot of doors for me
Mm.
when I did it, and I was very, I've never been sorry that I've done it. It's a very testing qualification for sure. I think that it deserves its reputation because it's not easy. It really isn't easy.
Mm.
And so yeah, I think it definitely deserves the reputation that it has. As I say, in terms of it's changed a lot. I did mine before the change to it being modular and what have you. I'm very old. So it was a little bit different. But I think that if you want to go into management, then yeah, it's a great way of proving yourself to people and learning something obviously about it. It's definitely designed, the Delta generally I think is designed, as CELTA is, to be a very practical qualification, something which will enable a future employer to look at you and say, yes, this person really does have the practical skills as well as the theoretical roots, particularly at Delta level.
Jo, I want to thank you very much for this lovely interview. I'll be honest with you. Your channel has saved my life during the CELTA course, and I can't thank you enough, to be honest. It's
Very
true.
sweet.
Yeah, it's coming genuinely from me, because I've been always looking for YouTube channels that could provide clear, concise information on how to progress within the CELTA, even when it comes to CPD, continuing professional development. Your channel has very much helped me a lot. I mean, what makes you unique from other teachers from your channel, the way you deliver information is so concise, and even in those whose language level as a B1 on a Cambridge level can understand what you're saying very clearly. And it's quite a talent, to be honest.
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to say. So I really enjoyed the video making, and it's been for me a very interesting journey, because I think throughout my career, and something I would definitely say to novice teachers, or not so novice teachers, is that keeping yourself interested in the job long term, so I've been teaching for over 30 years, absolutely is about finding the new, finding the interest in what you're doing. And for me, learning to teach in video format, having become reasonably proficient in a classroom, I think I can engage people in a classroom, but it's very different when you're teaching on video, because you do have to have different skill set. I think it does have to be more concise, it does have to be pithier, it will be a lot shorter than you would spend in a classroom doing the same thing. You've got to think about how you would put that information over to people when you don't know what their reaction is, when you don't, if you're in a classroom, whether learners have understood or not, because you can ask them, or you can see whether they look confused. But you can't do that obviously if you're providing stuff on video. So it is important to think about how can you make that clear, and also because it's such a visual medium. So I think it's a very different animal to teaching in a classroom, because you have to think about the visual coherence of it as well as the content coherence, perhaps.
I guess so. So everybody, be sure to watch Jo's channel, and also visit her website if you're planning to go into the ELT industry or become an excellent English teacher in that sense. Jo, thank you again. I hope to see you again in another meeting, or maybe do a podcast together.
Lovely. Well, it was very nice to meet you and to talk to you, and I wish you well with your ongoing career.
All right.